Shalom, beloved. My name is Ms. Highsmith, and I'm so glad that you've decided to join me here today for the APA Apology Response Series. If you weren't aware, back in February of 2021, the American Psychological Association, or better known as the APA, distributed a public apology to people and communities of color for the part they played in promoting, perpetuating, and failing to challenge racism, racial discrimination, and human hierarchy in the United States. Beloved, let us begin. For in this episode, we'll start specifically with paragraph number 22, where I quote, "Whereas psychologists created and promoted the widespread application of psychological tests and instruments that have been used to disadvantage many communities of color, contributing to the overdiagnosis, misdiagnosis, and lack of culturally appropriate diagnostic criteria to characterize the lived experience and mental health concerns of people of color." Closed quote. Beloved, the legacy of psychological testing is marked by harm. Tests designed and promoted by psychologists that fail to account for cultural differences, leading to significant disadvantages for communities of color. These tests reinforced racial stereotypes, justified discriminatory practices, and ultimately contributed to systemic inequalities. I'll highlight some key tests and how they were used to harm communities of color. Number one, the intelligence quotient test, better known as the IQ test. The Stanford-Binet intelligence scales. This was developed in the early 20th century. This test became a standard for measuring intellectual ability. However, it was normed on predominantly white populations, which ignored cultural and linguistic differences. As a result, many children of color, particularly Black and immigrant children, were disproportionately classified as intellectually disabled or placed in special education programs, often based on an inaccurate and biased understanding of their intellectual capacities. Next is the Army Alpha and Beta test. During World War I, these tests were used to assess military recruits. The Army Alpha was a written test, and the Army Beta was a nonverbal test for those who were illiterate or non-English speakers. These tests led to conclusions that certain racial and ethnic groups, especially African Americans and immigrants, were intellectually inferior, which justified segregation and discriminatory policies in the military. Number two was the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, better known as the MMPI. This was first developed in the 1930s and 1940s. The MMPI was designed to assess personality and psychopathology. However, its cultural bias was clear. It was normed on a predominantly white, middle class population, which meant that when applied to people of color, the results were often misinterpreted. This led to discriminatory outcomes in various fields, including employment and criminal justice, where people of color were more likely to be pathologized based on misunderstandings rooted in cultural bias. Number three, projective tests. The Rorschach Inkblot Test. The subjective nature of the Rorschach test and the biases of psychologists interpreting the results led to misdiagnoses. When administered to people of color, particularly in clinical settings, these misinterpretations often reinforced stereotypes, leading to harm in the mental health field. Next is the thematic apperception test, the TAT. This test, which requires individuals to create stories based on ambiguous images, often presented scenarios that reflected white middle class norms. When administered to people of color, the cultural disconnect between the test and their lived experiences led to inaccurate and biased diagnoses. Number 4, educational placement test. Standardized achievement tests, the SAT or the ACT. These tests have long been critiqued for their cultural bias, often disadvantaging students of color. These tests play a significant role in college admissions, and their biased nature has contributed to disparities in educational opportunities for students of color. Next is our California Achievement Test, the CAT. Widely used in public schools, the CAT was also criticized for being culturally biased. The content of the test often reflected the experiences and knowledge of white middle class students, putting students of color at a disadvantage and often misplacing them into lower educational tracks again. Number 5, adaptive behavioral scales. The Vineland Adaptive Behavioral Scales. This was used to assess adaptive behavior in individuals with developmental disabilities. These scales contain cultural biases in their questions and interpretations, leading to disproportionate diagnoses of intellectual disabilities in children of color. Number 6, psychological assessments in legal settings. Competency to stand trial evaluations. Psychological tests used in legal settings to assess whether a defendant is competent to stand trial have also been criticized for their cultural bias, leading to unfair treatment of defendants of color. These biased practices have contributed to systemic inequalities in education, employment, mental health treatment, and the criminal justice system. They have perpetuated cycles of disadvantage, reinforced harmful stereotypes, and exacerbated the disparities that continue to affect these communities. Now, let's take a closer look at some of the harmful effects. Overdiagnosis. This occurs when individuals are diagnosed with a mental health condition they do not have, often leading to unnecessary treatment and stigmatization. In communities of color, this can happen due to cultural misunderstandings for biases. For example, studies have been shown that Black and Latino children are more likely to be diagnosed with ADHD than their white peers due to misinterpretation of cultural behaviors. Similarly, African Americans have historically been overdiagnosed with schizophrenia, a diagnosis often tied to racial biases. Misdiagnosis. Misdiagnosis refers to the incorrect identification of a mental health disorder, which leads to inappropriate or ineffective treatment. Communities of color are often misdiagnosed due to a lack of cultural competence among mental health professionals. For example, Latino individuals may be misdiagnosed with bipolar disorder due to cultural differences in how symptoms are expressed, while Asian Americans may express underdiagnosis of depression due to cultural variations in expressing emotional distress. Next is the lack of culturally appropriate diagnostic criteria. The diagnostic criteria used in mental health care are often based on Western norms, which fail to account for the lived experiences of people of color. This results in inaccurate diagnosis and ineffective treatments, which further contribute to disparities in mental health outcomes. Consequences for communities of color. The overdiagnosis, misdiagnosis, and lack of cultural relevance in psychological testing have significant consequences. Ineffective treatment. When individuals are misdiagnosed or overdiagnosed, they often receive treatments that don't address their actual needs, leading to frustration, ineffective care, and reluctance to seek further help. Next is stigmatization. Misdiagnosis can lead to stigmatization, which can deter individuals from seeking mental health care in the future and reinforce negative stereotypes. Disparities in mental health outcomes. These diagnostic flaws contribute to broader disparities in mental health outcomes, worsening symptoms and creating cycles of inequality. To address these issues, we must focus on cultural competence training. We need to ensure mental health professionals receive training on cultural differences and develop diagnostic tools that are inclusive and culturally relevant. Inclusive research. More research is needed to understand how mental health concerns manifest in diverse populations. This will help create diagnostic tools that reflect the experiences of all communities. Next, we'll have community engagement. Communities of color must be actively involved in the development of mental health services to ensure they are culturally appropriate and effective. In conclusion, beloved, the misuse of psychological testing in communities of color has had a profound and lasting impact. Overdiagnosis, misdiagnosis, and culturally inappropriate diagnostic criteria have contributed to systemic inequalities, perpetuating harm in education, mental health, and legal systems. But through cultural competence, inclusive research, and community engagement, we can begin to heal the damage done. Thank you for joining me on this journey toward understanding and change. I look forward to seeing you next time. Shalom, beloved.